The woman didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She leaned forward, close enough that her perfume cut through the recycled air, and said, "You're sitting in the wrong seat. I need you to move. Now." The sentence landed like a slap. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Around them, the first-class cabin held its breath. The soft hum of the plane at the gate, the faint clink of glassware. A baby crying somewhere far back, muffled by distance and privilege. Every eye shifted, careful not to stare too obviously. The man in the seat did not move. He didn't look startled. He didn't look angry. He looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with travel. Mid-50s, salt and pepper hair cropped close. A navy jacket that had been pressed too many times to look new, but too well cared for to look cheap. His hands rested on the armrests, steady. No ring, no watch that begged for attention. Just a quiet stillness that didn't belong in places like this. "I believe this is my seat," he said calmly, his voice low, measured. The way people spoke when they were used to being interrupted and chose their words like tools. The woman smiled. It wasn't warm. It was the smile of someone who had never been told no and had no intention of starting today. She glanced at the seat number again, even though she already knew it by heart. 1A, the front left, the best view, the seat people noticed. "I always sit here," she said, turning slightly so the flight attendant hovering nearby could hear. "There's been a mistake." The flight attendant hesitated. She was young, late 20s maybe, hair pulled tight, posture straight from years of training that taught compliance before courage. She glanced at the boarding passes, then at the woman's face, then back at the man. The calculation happened fast and quietly. Who complains louder? Who has status? Who looks like trouble? "Sir," the attendant began, softly, like a warning disguised as politeness. "May I see your boarding pass again?" The man handed it over without comment. His fingers brushed hers. They were warm, steady, not shaking. The attendant scanned it, her brow tightening for just a second before smoothing out again. The seat was his, clear as day, paid in full, no upgrade, no mistake. But the woman had already turned away, signaling the end of the discussion as if it were a settled matter. She flagged another attendant with a sharp gesture of manicured fingers. "This is holding us up," she said. "I have a connection. Please fix this." The man watched all of it without speaking. His gaze moved slowly around the cabin. The man across the aisle pretending to read a newspaper, but watching over the top of it. The older couple 2 rows back, exchanging glances. The wife's lips pressed thin. The businessman behind him checking his phone, then angling it slightly. Not recording yet, but ready. He had seen this look before. This moment. Not just in airports. In boardrooms. In courtrooms. In restaurants, where the check always landed in front of the wrong person. The unspoken question. "Are you sure you belong here?" The woman leaned down suddenly, her voice dropping. "Don't make this difficult," she said. "I'm doing you a favor by being polite." That was when the man finally looked up at her. Really looked. His eyes were dark, calm, unsettling in their patience. The kind of eyes that had watched storms form long before the first thunder. "You're not being polite," he said. "You're being careless." Her smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Careless wasn't a word people used with her. She straightened quickly, recovering. "I don't have time for this," she snapped. "Get the supervisor." The supervisor arrived in less than a minute. Early 40s, confident stride. The kind of man who knew exactly where he ranked in every room, and made sure others did too. He listened as the woman spoke, nodding along, already aligned before the story was finished. "She's a preferred customer," he said finally, addressing the man without meeting his eyes. "We're going to need you to relocate." "To where?" the man asked. "Coach has space," the supervisor replied, like he was offering a gift. A quiet ripple moved through the cabin. Someone inhaled sharply. Someone else muttered, "That's not right," under their breath. The flight attendant looked down at her shoes. The man leaned back in his seat, exhaled slowly through his nose, and closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not in defeat, in calculation. He was aware of the clock, of the cameras mounted discreetly above, of the policies written in vague language that always seemed to bend one way. He was aware that raising his voice would cost him more than silence ever could. "I'm not moving," he said, opening his eyes again. His tone didn't change. That was what made it dangerous. The supervisor stiffened. "Sir, if you refuse to comply with crew instructions, we can remove you from the flight." The word remove hung there, heavy, final. A few phones came out openly now. The businessman behind him started recording. The older woman, 2 rows back, shook her head slowly, disbelief etched into her face. The woman smiled again. This time, it reached her eyes. Victory was familiar territory. She picked up her purse, deliberately heavy, and placed it on the empty seat across the aisle, as if claiming more space by default. "Let's not make a scene," she said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Some people just don't understand how things work." The man stood. The cabin went still. He didn't stand fast. He rose slowly, deliberately, like someone who understood the weight of every movement. He straightened his jacket, reached down, and picked up his bag. As he did, a folded document slipped partially out of the side pocket. Thick paper, embossed seal. The supervisor noticed it. His eyes narrowed, curiosity flickering. The man tucked the document back in calmly. Then he looked at the supervisor, then at the woman, then at the flight attendant, who still hadn't said a word. "You're making a mistake," he said. Not as a threat, as a statement. The woman laughed softly. "Oh, sweetheart," she replied. "You already lost." He stepped into the aisle. The supervisor gestured toward the exit. The cameras followed. The phones followed. The moment stretched, tight with anticipation, the way moments do, right before something breaks. As he walked toward the front of the plane, the man passed the cockpit door. It opened slightly. A voice inside said his name. "Mr. Carter?" He stopped. The woman froze. The supervisor turned sharply, irritation flashing across his face. "Captain, we have a—" "I know," the voice said, firmer now. The door opened wider. The captain stepped out. Grey hair, weathered face. The look of someone who had spent decades making decisions at altitude. He looked past everyone else and locked eyes with the man in the aisle. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the captain said quietly. The man gave a small nod. "Had to see it for myself." The cabin erupted into whispers. The woman's smile slid off her face like something melting. "What is this?" she demanded. "Why are we delaying?" The captain didn't look at her. "Because," he said, still watching the man, "this flight is no longer the most important thing happening today." The man turned slightly now, the camera lights catching his face fully for the first time. There was no triumph in his expression, no anger, just resolve. Outside the window, somewhere beyond the terminal glass, an engine roared to life. Not the hollow whine of a commercial jet, but a deeper sound. Controlled, expensive. The kind of sound people turned to look at without knowing why. The woman followed their gaze, and for the first time since she boarded, she didn't speak. The captain closed the cockpit door behind him with a soft, deliberate click that echoed louder than it should have. The cabin felt smaller after that, compressed by tension and the sudden awareness that something irreversible had begun. The man stood in the aisle, bag still in his hand, while the supervisor shifted his weight, uncertainty creeping into his posture like a slow leak. "Back to your seat, David," the captain said quietly, not as an order, but as a courtesy. David Carter turned, meeting the captain's eyes for a brief moment that carried years of shared understanding. He stepped back into seat 1A without urgency, set his bag down, and sat. The flight attendant exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and retreated 2 steps, as if distance alone could protect her from what was unfolding. The woman remained standing. Eleanor Whitman had not moved. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse, knuckles paling as she searched the captain's face for recognition, for correction, for control. None came. "This is absurd," she said finally, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle even to her own ears. "I have clearance. You know who my husband is." The captain turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "I know exactly who your husband is," he replied. "That's why you should take your assigned seat." Assigned. The word struck harder than any insult. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, but the supervisor touched her elbow, gently, urgently. "Mom," he whispered, "please." She stared at him, disbelief flashing across her face. He had been so confident moments ago, so eager to move someone else out of the way. Now his eyes wouldn't meet hers. Something had shifted, and she didn't know where the ground had gone. Eleanor sat. Around them, the cabin resumed its careful performance of normalcy. Seatbelts clicked. Overhead bins closed. A man 2 rows back cleared his throat and folded his newspaper with exaggerated focus. Phones slid back into pockets, though a few screens still glowed faintly, recording just in case. David leaned back, eyes forward, hands folded loosely in his lap. His pulse was steady. It had taken decades to learn how to control it in moments like this. He felt the weight of the stares, the questions forming behind eyes too polite to ask them aloud. He let them sit unanswered. The engines powered up. The plane began its slow pushback from the gate, the floor vibrating beneath their feet. Eleanor stared straight ahead, jaw tight, replaying the scene in her mind, searching for the moment she had lost control. She told herself this was a misunderstanding, a temporary embarrassment. These things could be fixed. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down instinctively, then froze. No service. She tried again. Nothing. The familiar reassurance of instant connection was gone, replaced by a hollow icon that offered no explanation. Across the aisle, David noticed. Not the phone itself, but the change in her breathing, the shallow inhale, the way her shoulders stiffened. He said nothing. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be departing shortly. Please remain seated." Shortly. Another word that carried more weight than it should have. As the plane taxied, a low rumble grew outside, distinct from the steady hum beneath them. Heads turned toward the windows. Even Eleanor couldn't help herself. She leaned slightly, peering past the wing, her breath catching as she recognized the sleek silhouette gliding into position on the parallel runway. The jet was unmistakable. Long, white, polished to a mirror sheen, but reflected the afternoon sun like a blade. No airline markings, no visible logos, just a thin, dark stripe along its side, understated and confident. David followed her gaze. His expression didn't change. The jet paused, engines spooling with a sound that was less raw than promise. A ground vehicle approached, then another. A set of stairs rolled into place with mechanical precision. Eleanor's throat tightened. She knew that jet. She had flown in one just like it, countless times, wrapped in comfort so complete it felt like entitlement. Her mind raced, grasping for context. This wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. Her phone buzzed again, once, then went dark entirely. The supervisor shifted in his seat, eyes fixed on the window now, color draining from his face as recognition dawned. He glanced at David, then away, as if looking too directly might draw attention he couldn't afford. The jet's door opened. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the sky. The angle made it hard to see his face, but the posture was unmistakable. Upright, unhurried, in control. He raised a hand briefly, not waving, just acknowledging the crew waiting below. Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine. The captain's voice returned, lower this time, meant only for those listening closely. "We'll be holding here for a moment to allow a priority departure." Priority. The word landed like a verdict. David closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, watching as the jet began its takeoff roll. The engines screamed, a sound that cut through the cabin and into bone. The smaller plane rocked slightly in its wake, a reminder of scale, of hierarchy, of forces beyond complaint. The jet lifted effortlessly, nose rising, body separating from the earth as if gravity itself had made an exception. It climbed fast, banking away with a grace that felt almost deliberate, almost theatrical. Silence followed. Heavy. Absolute. Eleanor sat rigid, staring at the empty sky where the jet had been. Her reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Smaller, somehow. Edges blurred. She pressed her lips together, fighting the tremor in her hands. Only then did she notice David watching her. Not gloating, not smiling, just watching, the way one might observe a storm finally passing overhead. She swallowed, pride warring with a sudden, unwelcome fear. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low, meant only for him. David looked away, gaze returning to the front of the cabin. "It was over before it started," he replied quietly. The plane began to move again, slow and unsteady compared to what they had just witnessed. The engines strained. The vibration felt harsher now, less refined. Eleanor leaned back, eyes closing as she tried to steady her breathing. She told herself she would make calls as soon as they landed, that her husband would handle this, that the world would snap back into its proper order. But somewhere, deep down, a different thought took root, unwelcome and persistent. For the first time in a very long time, she wondered if she had mistaken access for authority, proximity for power. David felt the shift in the cabin as the plane finally lifted into the air. Relief mingled with discomfort, the familiar feeling of being suspended between places, between outcomes. He reached into his bag and removed the folded document, smoothing it carefully on the tray table without opening it. Across the aisle, the older woman who had been watching him leaned slightly closer. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "That should never have happened." David met her eyes and nodded once. "Thank you," he said. It was enough. The cabin settled into its rhythm. Drinks were served. Conversations resumed in cautious tones. The moment began to recede, filed away in memory where it would be replayed later, reshaped, argued over. But for Eleanor, there was no comfort in routine. Only the echo of that engine, the image of the jet rising without her, and the unsettling realization that some doors, once closed, did not reopen. David closed his eyes and let the hum of the plane wash over him. He thought of the work waiting ahead, the decisions that would ripple outward, affecting people who would never know his name. He thought of the cost of silence and the cost of speaking up. Outside, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, holding all of it without judgment. The wheels touched down hard, a jolt that rippled through the cabin and snapped Eleanor Whitman fully back into her body. The applause that followed was thin, reflexive, the sound of people grateful to be finished with something uncomfortable. David remained still, eyes open now, watching the runway blur past as the plane decelerated. He counted his breaths. He always did after moments like that. It helped him remember where he was. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Eleanor's phone flickered back to life. 1 bar, then 2. The familiar surge of relief hit her chest, sharp and immediate. She unlocked the screen, already forming the words she would use, the tone she would take. Control could be reclaimed. It always could. The first notification loaded slowly, like a bruise surfacing under skin. A missed call. Then another. Then a text from her husband's chief of staff, sent 12 minutes earlier. Call me now. Her thumb hovered, then pressed. The line rang once, twice, then connected with a click that sounded final. Where are you? The voice said. Not Richard's. Younger, tight, strained. I just landed, Eleanor replied. What's going on? I need Richard. There was a pause on the line, filled with the faint hum of an office she knew well. He's in a meeting, the aide said. Emergency meeting. You need to come straight here. Eleanor straightened in her seat. I'm on my way, she said sharply. And I want to know why my phone stopped working. Another pause, longer this time. We'll explain when you arrive. The call ended before she could respond. The seatbelt sign chimed off. People began to stand, reaching for bags, slipping back into their practiced impatience. Eleanor remained seated, staring at her phone as if it had betrayed her personally. Her reflection in the darkened screen looked older than it had an hour ago. The lines around her mouth seemed deeper. She lifted her chin, refusing to acknowledge the thought. Across the aisle, David stood smoothly, lifting his bag with ease. The supervisor avoided him completely now, eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the aisle. His earlier authority evaporated. David felt no satisfaction in that. Only a familiar, hollow recognition. People were brave until the wind changed. As the line began to move, Eleanor rose abruptly, nearly colliding with him. She caught herself on the seat back, breath hitching. For a brief moment, they stood close enough to hear each other breathe. You planned this, she said quietly, anger sharpening her words. You set me up. David looked down at her, not towering, not looming, just present. No, he said. You walked into it. She scoffed, but there was no humor in it. You think you're clever, she snapped. You think this ends something. He stepped past her into the aisle. It begins, Clarity, he replied, already moving on. The jet bridge felt colder than usual, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. Eleanor's heels clicked too loudly against the floor as she followed the flow of passengers, her mind racing ahead, assembling explanations, defenses, counterattacks. She had lived her life as the wife of a powerful man. That identity did not vanish because of one strange flight. At the end of the bridge, a man in a dark suit waited, posture rigid, eyes scanning faces with practiced efficiency. When he saw Eleanor, his shoulders sagged slightly, relief mixing with dread. Mrs. Whitman, he said, falling into step beside her. The car is outside. Good, she said. I'm late. He hesitated. There's been movement. She stopped walking. Passengers streamed around them, irritation flaring at the obstruction. What kind of movement? He lowered his voice. The board convened early. Regulators were notified. The bank flagged several accounts. Eleanor stared at him. That's impossible. It's happening, he said quietly. Right now. Her chest tightened. The terminal seemed to tilt, the noise swelling and receding in waves. She forced herself to move again, each step deliberate, measured, as if moving carefully enough could undo what she was hearing. The car ride was a blur of traffic and flashing lights. Eleanor stared out the window, watching the city she thought she knew slide past, indifferent to her distress. She called Richard again. straight to voicemail. She left a message this time, clipped and controlled, asking for updates, for reassurance. The building loomed ahead, all glass and steel, a monument to certainty. As they entered the lobby, Eleanor sensed it immediately. The energy was wrong. Voices were hushed, eyes darted away too quickly. A group of men stood near the elevators, suits rumpled, expressions tight. She spotted Richard at the far end, surrounded by lawyers. He looked older than he had that morning, shoulders hunched, jaw clenched. When he saw her, his face tightened further. "What did you do?" he demanded as soon as she reached him. Eleanor recoiled. "What did I do?" she shot back. "I was on a plane. You told me to create a distraction. That's all I did." Richard glanced at the men around him, then back at her. "You drew attention," he hissed. "You made it personal." "I took a seat," she said. "That's it." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitman," he said carefully, "there are allegations now. Serious ones. The timing is unfortunate." Eleanor felt the room closing in. Allegations of what? "Market manipulation," the lawyer replied. "Undisclosed partnerships. Improper access." Her stomach dropped. She thought of the jet lifting into the sky, of David's calm, of the way the captain had spoken his name. "You said this was contained," she whispered to Richard. "It was," he said, his voice cracking. "Until it wasn't." Across town, in a quieter building far from glass towers and boardrooms, David sat at a wooden table, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. The room smelled faintly of dust and old books. A woman in her 60s sat across from him, silver hair pulled back, eyes sharp behind thin-framed glasses. "You understand, this escalates," she said. "Once we proceed, there's no pulling it back." David nodded. "I understand." "You didn't initiate this," she continued, "but you are triggering consequences." "I didn't choose the method," he said. "I chose not to ignore it." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. That's what I needed to hear. Outside, the day moved on, unaware of the quiet decisions being made inside rooms like these. Phones rang, emails were sent, doors closed. Back in the glass tower, Eleanor sat alone in a conference room, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. The certainty she had worn like armor felt thin now, cracked. She pressed her palms flat against the table, grounding herself. She had taken a seat she thought belonged to her. She was beginning to understand how wrong she had been. David stood and gathered his coat. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. Responsibility, not power, never power. Just responsibility. He walked toward it without hesitation. The conference room clock ticked louder than it should have, each second pressing into Eleanor Whitman's skull like a reminder she could not silence. The glass walls reflected her back at herself from every angle, a woman sitting straighter than necessary, hands folded too neatly, chin lifted in defiance, even as something underneath began to fracture. Outside the room, silhouettes moved with purpose, stopping, whispering, moving on again. No one came in. When the door finally opened, Richard Whitman did not look at her. He closed it carefully, as if the sound might travel, then loosened his tie with hands that trembled, despite his effort to control them. He had spent his life commanding rooms with a glance, bending outcomes with a phrase. Now he looked like a man who had misread the weather and sailed straight into a storm. "They froze the secondary accounts," he said. "Not all of them, not yet, but enough." Eleanor's mouth went dry. "On whose authority?" "Multiple," he replied. "Regulators, banking compliance. A congressional inquiry request came in less than an hour ago." She stared at him. "That's impossible. You don't move like that unless someone has been building a file," Richard finished quietly. "For a long time." The words settled between them, heavy, undeniable. Eleanor thought of the man on the plane, the way he had stood without rushing, without pleading, the way the captain had said his name, David Carter. She had dismissed him because he had let her, because she believed silence meant weakness. "Why now?" she whispered. Richard's jaw tightened. Because someone decided to stop waiting. Across the city, David sat alone in a narrow office overlooking a river choked with late afternoon traffic. The light slanted in low and golden, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. And the desk in front of him lay a thin folder, unmarked, its contents memorized rather than read. He did not touch it. He had already made his choice. His phone buzzed once, then again. He ignored it until the third vibration, the number familiar enough to merit attention. He answered without greeting. "It's moving faster than expected," said the voice on the other end. Calm, female, seasoned by years of careful decisions. That always happens once the first domino falls. David leaned back, eyes closing briefly. "Collateral. There's always collateral," she replied. "You stayed within the lines. That matters." He exhaled slowly. "To whom?" "To history," she said. "Eventually." The call ended. David remained still, listening to the distant sound of traffic, of a city that never noticed the moments when its course shifted. He thought of the older woman on the plane who had apologized, of the flight attendant who had looked down at her shoes, of Eleanor's voice, sharp with certainty, then edged with something else entirely. Back in the tower, Eleanor paced the length of the conference room, heels clicking too fast, too loud. "We need to get ahead of this," she said. "Control the narrative. Call in favors." Richard sank into a chair. "I've made the calls," he said. "They're not answering." She stopped short. "They always answer." "They don't," he said, looking at her now, really looking. "Not when they're worried about being seen next to us." Eleanor felt a flicker of panic, quick and unwelcome. "This is about him," she said. "The man on the plane. He orchestrated this." Richard shook his head. "No," he said. "He allowed it." The distinction stung more than accusation. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Her thoughts raced back through the morning, replaying the moment she had leaned in, certain of the outcome. She had believed the rules would bend because they always had. "Why didn't you warn me?" she demanded. "If there was even a chance. I didn't think you'd draw attention," Richard snapped, his composure cracking at last. "I didn't think you'd make it visible." Silence followed, thick, unforgiving. Across town, David rose from his chair and stepped to the window. The river below moved steadily, indifferent to the glass towers and power plays above it. He thought of his father, a man who had worked 2 jobs and taught him early that dignity was not something granted by others. It was something you carried, whether anyone noticed or not. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "They're scrambling," said the voice on the other end. A man this time, younger, energized by the momentum. "Media's circling. They want comment." "Not yet," David said. "Let them sit with the questions." "Understood." David ended the call and picked up his coat. There was more to do, but none of it required spectacle. That had never been his way. Eleanor sat alone now. The room emptied around her as advisors were pulled into other conversations, other crises. She stared at the city through the glass, seeing it as she never had before, not as a backdrop to her life, but as a system that could move on without her consent. Her phone rang, a number she did not recognize. She hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Whitman," a man's voice said. Polite, neutral. "This is Special Counsel Harris. I'm calling to inform you that we'll need to speak with you regarding several matters connected to Whitman Group." Eleanor's grip tightened. I have counsel. Of course, he replied. We encourage it. The line went dead. She sat there for a long moment, the weight of the room pressing in, the certainty she had lived by eroding piece by piece. She thought of the seat on the plane, of how small the act had seemed, how inconsequential. A gesture, a reminder of order. Order, she realized now, only existed as long as everyone agreed to it. David stepped into the hallway, coat over his arm, nodding to a receptionist who smiled back without knowing why. As he reached the elevator, his phone vibrated one last time. A text, short, simple. Proceeding as planned. He slipped the phone into his pocket as the doors closed, his reflection staring back at him in the mirrored surface. Older, tired, steady. He had not sought this moment, but he would not waste it either. The elevator descended, carrying him back into the flow of the city, into the work that waited beyond headlines and glass towers. Behind him, far above, Eleanor Whitman remained seated in a room that no longer belonged to her, listening to the clock tick, understanding at last that some seats, once taken, could never truly be claimed. Morning arrived without ceremony. No headlines blared from radios in kitchens or cafes. No alerts buzzed phones with breaking banners. The world did not wake up knowing anything had changed. And that was exactly how David preferred it. He stood in his kitchen, sleeves rolled up, watching water boil in a steel kettle that had belonged to his father. The sound was familiar, grounding. Outside, the city stretched awake in stages. Garbage trucks groaned down the alley. A dog barked once, then settled. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor practiced piano, the notes uneven but earnest. David poured the water, waited for the coffee to bloom, and inhaled. He had learned long ago not to rush the moments that came before storms. His phone lay face down on the counter. He did not need to look at it to know it had been busy all night. Across town, Eleanor Whitman woke in a guest bedroom she had not slept in for years. The sheets were crisp, hotel white, tucked too tight. She lay still, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun soundlessly above her. For the first time in decades, she had woken without knowing exactly what her day would demand of her. Her phone sat on the nightstand, screen dark, heavier than it should have been. She reached for it, hesitated, then turned it over. 3 missed calls, all from numbers she recognized, none from the ones she wanted. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood slowly, her joints stiff, her balance uncertain. The mirror across the room caught her reflection mid-movement. She looked older this morning. Not dramatically so, just enough to notice. Downstairs, Richard sat at the dining table, papers spread before him like evidence. He had not slept. His tie from the day before lay discarded over a chair, his jacket draped carelessly nearby. He did not look up when Eleanor entered. "They're asking for interviews," he said, voice flat. "Not statements. Interviews." Eleanor poured herself a glass of water, drank half of it too quickly, then set it down with a hand that shook despite her effort. "You told me this was contained." "It was," Richard said, "until it wasn't." She closed her eyes briefly. "You keep saying that. It keeps being true." Silence settled between them, thick with things neither was ready to say aloud. Eleanor broke it first. "What happens now?" Richard rubbed his temples. "Now we respond. Carefully. Slowly. We don't fight in public." "And him?" Eleanor said, her voice tightening. "What about him?" Richard looked up then, really looked at her. "He's not our problem," he said. "He never was." That landed harder than she expected. David left his apartment just after 8. He wore a simple grey coat, nothing that marked him as important. On the street, people passed him without a glance, caught up in their own mornings. He walked the few blocks to his office instead of driving, letting the movement settle his thoughts. The building he worked in was older than the glass towers downtown, brick and stone, renovated, but not transformed. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old paper. The receptionist looked up and smiled, genuine. "Morning," she said. "Morning," David replied. He took the stairs, 2 at a time, ignoring the elevator. On the 3rd floor, his team waited in the conference room, tension coiled tight but contained. They fell quiet as he entered. "We stick to process," David said before anyone could speak. "No commentary, no speculation. We document everything." A younger man leaned forward, anxious energy radiating from him. "They're trying to frame this as retaliation." David nodded. They would. A woman at the far end of the table folded her arms. "Are we prepared if this widens?" "We've been prepared," David said calmly. "That's the point." He watched their faces as the words settled. Fear, resolve, relief. People did their best work when they knew where they stood. By midday, the first article broke. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just careful reporting, outlining inquiries, timelines, unanswered questions. Eleanor read it on her phone in the back seat of a car that felt suddenly too exposed. Her name appeared halfway down, not prominently, not yet. She felt a sharp pang of indignation, followed by something else. Relief, maybe? Or denial. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, curiosity flickering before professionalism smoothed it away. Eleanor straightened, reclaiming posture if nothing else. The car pulled up in front of a low, nondescript building. No marble lobby, no grand entrance, just glass doors and a security desk. Eleanor hesitated before stepping out, the weight of the moment pressing in. Inside, a woman with kind eyes but a firm mouth greeted her. "Mrs. Whitman," she said. "This way." The room they led her to was small, neutral. No windows, 2 chairs, a table. Eleanor sat, hands folded, chin lifted, summoning the composure that had carried her through decades of negotiation and performance. She waited. Back at his office, David watched rain begin to streak the windows, thin lines tracing downward like restless thoughts. His phone buzzed once, a message from an unfamiliar number. She's in the building. David closed his eyes, just for a second. He felt no satisfaction, only gravity. He typed a brief response and sent it, then set the phone aside. The interview lasted longer than Eleanor expected. Questions came calmly, methodically, building on one another. She answered carefully, choosing words the way she always had. She spoke of misunderstandings, of context, of assumptions. The woman across from her listened without interrupting, taking notes, nodding occasionally. When Eleanor finished, there was a pause. "Thank you," the woman said. "We may need to speak again." Eleanor stood, smoothing her jacket. "Of course." As she turned to leave, the woman added, "One more thing." Eleanor stopped. "The seat on the plane," the woman said gently. "It matters." Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed. She nodded once and left without another word. David worked late, not out of urgency, but habit. When he finally shut down his computer, the building was quiet, the hallways dim. He stepped outside into the rain, letting it soak his coat, cool his skin. He thought of Eleanor sitting in that small room, of Richard at his table, of the younger version of himself who had once believed power was something you seized. He knew better now. The rain fell steadily as he walked, washing the city in a muted grey that softened edges and blurred distinctions. Somewhere, consequences were unfolding. Somewhere else, Someone was waking up to a world that no longer bent so easily. David moved through it all without hurry, carrying with him the weight of decisions made and the quiet certainty that some things, once set in motion, would find their own end. The rain had stopped by the time Eleanor Whitman stepped out of the building, but the air still carried its weight, damp and heavy, clinging to her clothes as if unwilling to let her go. She paused on the sidewalk, unsure which direction to turn, the city suddenly unfamiliar despite decades of navigating it with ease. Cars passed. People walked by. No one looked at her twice. The driver opened the car door without comment. Eleanor slid into the back seat and closed her eyes, listening to the muted thrum of traffic. Her phone rested in her lap, silent. For the first time, silence felt accusatory. Across town, David sat in a dimly lit restaurant that had been there longer than most of the people who now frequented the neighborhood. The booths were worn smooth, the menu unchanged for years. He liked places that didn't reinvent themselves to stay relevant. They reminded him that endurance mattered more than novelty. He ate slowly, alone, watching condensation slide down his glass. At the bar, two men argued quietly about baseball, their voices rising and falling in familiar rhythms. Life went on, stubborn and ordinary. His phone vibrated. He checked it, then slipped it back into his pocket without replying. Some conversations could wait. Eleanor arrived home just after dusk. The house greeted her with the same polished stillness it always had, but it felt hollow now, like a stage after the audience had gone. She set her purse down with more force than necessary and stood in the foyer, listening to the echo fade. Richard was in his study, the door half open, light spilled into the hallway. Eleanor stepped inside and found him staring at his computer screen, unmoving. "They asked about you," she said, breaking the silence. He didn't turn. "They would." "They asked about the plane," she added. That got his attention. He looked at her then, eyes sharp with a mix of irritation and something closer to fear. "And," Eleanor swallowed, "they said it mattered." Richard leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Everything matters now." She moved closer, lowering herself into the chair opposite him. "You never told me how deep this went." "I didn't know how deep it was," he replied. "Not until it started moving." Eleanor studied his face, searching for reassurance, for the certainty she had always relied on. She found none. The man in front of her looked tired, older than she remembered, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by worry. "This is because of him," she said again, softer now. Richard shook his head. "No. This is because we assumed no one would push back." The words settled over her like a verdict. Eleanor leaned back, staring at the ceiling. She thought of the seat, of the way she had leaned in, confident, dismissive. She had believed the world would rearrange itself, as it always had. Across the city, David left the restaurant and walked the long way home, hands in his pockets, coat unbuttoned. The streets glistened under streetlights, reflections shimmering with each passing car. He breathed deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs. He passed a small park where a few children played under the watchful eyes of parents. Laughter cut through the quiet, sharp and fleeting. David slowed, watching for a moment, then continued on. At home, he poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, city lights blinking on and off in the distance. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. "They're pushing for a statement," said the voice on the other end. "Public pressure's building." "Let it," David replied. "We're not here to perform." There was a pause. "They're going to come after you personally." David's reflection stared back at him from the dark glass. "They already did," he said. "It didn't work." The call ended. David set the phone down and leaned his forehead briefly against the window. He felt the familiar ache in his shoulders, the accumulation of years spent carrying responsibility quietly. He didn't resent it. He had chosen this path. Eleanor spent the evening pacing the house, touching objects as if to reassure herself they were still real. The piano she never played. The photographs on the wall, moments frozen in time, smiles wide and confident. She stopped in front of one taken years ago on a private jet, champagne flutes raised in celebration. She turned the frame face down. Later, she found herself in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator without opening it. Hunger felt irrelevant. She poured a glass of wine instead, then set it aside, untouched. Her phone buzzed. A message from a friend. Short, careful, checking in. Eleanor stared at it, fingers hovering over the screen. She typed a response, erased it, typed again. In the end, she sent nothing. In his apartment, David prepared for bed with the same routine he had followed for years. He folded his clothes neatly. He set his alarm. He read a few pages of a book he had started weeks ago, the words sinking in slowly. Before turning out the light, he checked his phone one last time. No new messages. Good. Eleanor lay awake long after midnight, staring into the dark. The house creaked softly around her, settling noises she had heard 1,000 times without noticing. Tonight, each sound felt amplified. She thought of the woman on the plane who had watched silently, of the captain's voice, of the jet rising without her. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a future where things did not return to the way they had been. The thought frightened her more than any investigation. Morning came again, indifferent. Sunlight crept through the curtains in both homes, touching two very different lives bound together by a moment neither could undo. One rose with a sense of purpose intact, steady despite the weight ahead. The other lay still, listening to the quiet, understanding at last that power, once questioned, never quite feels the same again. The morning news played softly on the kitchen television as Eleanor Whitman stood at the counter, unmoving, a cup of coffee cooling untouched beneath her hands. The anchor's voice was measured, professional, almost gentle as it outlined developments at Whitman Group. Regulatory review, internal audits, temporary pauses. No accusations yet, just enough to make donors nervous and partners cautious. Eleanor watched without blinking. The words slid past her, familiar and foreign at the same time. This was the language she had lived inside for decades, the hum beneath galas and bored dinners, the invisible machinery that kept their world balanced. Now the hum had changed pitch. Not loud, not panicked, just off. Richard entered the kitchen without greeting, already on his phone, his voice low and clipped. No, I understand. Yes, I'll call back. He ended the call and set the phone down with more force than intended. They're cancelling lunches, Eleanor said quietly, eyes still on the screen. Richard didn't deny it. He poured himself coffee, black, and drank it standing up. They're rescheduling, he said. There's a difference. She turned to him then. Is there? He met her gaze, irritation flaring, then fading into something more fragile. You don't abandon a ship over rumors, he said. You wait for proof. And if the proof comes... Richard looked away. Outside, a lawn service truck rumbled past, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. Then we adapt. Across town, David sat in a narrow conference room with two people he trusted enough to argue with him. The blinds were half drawn, light slicing the table into sharp angles. A folder lay open between them, thin but heavy with implication. They're circling, said the woman to his left, tapping a pen against the paper. Quietly, the way people do when they're deciding whether to cut bait. That's expected, David replied. The man across from him leaned forward. They're also trying to paint you as the instigator, that you provoked this to force scrutiny. David nodded. I did provoke scrutiny. That's not the same thing, the man said carefully. It is to them, David replied. And that's fine. The woman studied him. You're comfortable being the visible part of this. David considered the question. I'm comfortable being honest. Silence settled. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat in a quiet salon she had visited for years, her reflection multiplied in mirrors she had once found flattering. The stylist moved carefully now, less chatty, her questions clipped and neutral. Just a trim, Eleanor said. Nothing drastic. As the scissors snipped, Eleanor watched her own eyes in the glass. She looked the same. That was what unsettled her. She'd expected to see something different, some outward sign of the shift she felt inside. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and frowned. An unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. Mrs. Whitman, a man's voice said, smooth but formal. This is Daniel Ross. I represent Carter Systems. Eleanor's breath caught. I'm not speaking without counsel. Of course, Ross replied. This isn't a request for comment. It's a courtesy. A courtesy, she repeated flatly. Yes, he said. Mr. Carter wanted you to know that no further action is coming from his end. Eleanor laughed once, short and sharp. That's supposed to reassure me. It's supposed to be accurate, Ross said. Whatever happens next will not be initiated by him. The line went dead before she could respond. Eleanor stared at the phone, heart pounding. Around her, the salon hummed with dryers and muted conversation, life continuing as if nothing had changed. She felt suddenly exposed, as though everyone could see the thin crack running through her composure. David spent the evening at his desk, the city darkening beyond the windows. He read through emails methodically, answering some, ignoring others. He did not rush. He never rushed decisions that would outlast the moment. A message from an old colleague caught his eye. Short, direct. Be careful. They're desperate. David typed a response, then deleted it. He closed his laptop instead and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Desperation made people unpredictable. That was what concerned him. At home, Eleanor found Richard in the study again, this time with a bottle of whiskey open on the desk. He poured without offering her any. He called, she said. Richard stiffened. Who? David Carter. Richard's jaw tightened. What did he want? To tell me he's done, Eleanor said. That whatever happens now isn't coming from him. Richard scoffed. Magnanimous. That's what worries me, Eleanor replied. He's not pressing. He's waiting. Richard turned to her sharply. For what? She hesitated. For us to make a mistake. The words hung between them, unwelcome but undeniable. Richard looked down at his glass, swirling the amber liquid slowly. They want me to step back, he said finally. Eleanor stared at him. Who? The board, he replied. Temporarily, a gesture, to calm things. Her chest tightened. And you're considering it? He met her eyes. I might not have a choice. That night, Eleanor lay awake again, staring into the dark. She thought of the plane, of the way she had assumed the seat would move, the world would comply. She had not considered resistance. Not real resistance. Not quiet, immovable resolve. Across the city, David stood on his balcony, the cool night air brushing his face. The skyline glowed, indifferent and vast. Somewhere in those lights, decisions were being made that would reshape lives. He felt the weight of it, but not the fear. His phone buzzed. A single message. Board wants to talk. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, steady. He typed a response and sent it, then slipped the phone into his pocket. Below, traffic flowed like a river, headlights streaming past without pause. Above, the sky stretched wide and empty, offering no judgment, no promise. Just space. Eleanor rose before dawn, moving quietly through the house. She stood once more in front of the photograph she had turned face down days earlier. She flipped it back upright and studied it. The jet, the smiles, the certainty. She set it down gently, not face down this time, but turned slightly aside, as if acknowledging it without letting it dominate the room. David dressed simply that morning, tying his shoes with practiced ease. As he stepped out into the waking city, he felt the familiar calm settle over him. Whatever came next would come. He would meet it standing. Two lives moved forward under the same sky, bound by a moment neither could undo. Each learning in different ways that power was never about the seat you claimed, but about what you did when someone tried to take it away. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old money. The kind of room designed to make decisions feel inevitable rather than debated. David took his seat without ceremony, placing his notebook on the table and folding his hands over it. Around him, faces settled into practiced neutrality. Some he recognized as allies. Others watched him the way people watch weather, calculating whether to shelter or take advantage. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming on short notice." David nodded once. Of course. The meeting moved quickly at first, procedural updates delivered in careful language. Regulatory timelines, public posture, internal safeguards. David listened more than he spoke, tracking not just words, but tone, posture, the small shifts that revealed where loyalties bent. Then a man near the far end leaned forward, fingers steepled. "There's concern," he said, choosing the word deliberately, "that recent events have placed the company in a position of unnecessary visibility." David met his gaze. "Visibility isn't the same as vulnerability." "It can be," the man replied, "if handled poorly." Silence followed. The chairwoman watched David closely. "Do you believe this was handled poorly?" David considered the question, then spoke evenly. "I believe ignoring it would have been worse." A woman 2 seats down exhaled softly, relief flickering across her face. Another member frowned, lips pressed thin. The split was clear now. Across town, Eleanor Whitman sat in a private waiting room, the kind reserved for people accustomed to being shielded from inconvenience. The magazines were untouched, the artwork abstract and expensive. She clasped her hands in her lap, posture perfect, heart anything but. The door opened and a young associate stepped in, eyes avoiding hers. "They're ready for you." Eleanor stood, smoothing her jacket. About time. The conference room beyond was smaller than she expected. No long table, no crowd. Just 3 people seated, folders open, expressions professional and detached. Eleanor felt a familiar instinct rise, the urge to command the space. She pushed it down. "Mrs. Whitman," the man in the center said, "thank you for coming." She inclined her head. "Let's be efficient." They were. Questions came methodically, each building on the last, about travel, about communications, about timing. Eleanor answered carefully, drawing on years of experience navigating rooms like this. She kept her voice calm, her expressions measured. Then the woman to her left slid a photograph across the table. It was from the plane. Eleanor's breath caught despite herself. The image was grainy, taken from an angle that captured her standing in the aisle, her body angled forward, her hand mid-gesture. David's face was partially visible, turned toward her, expression unreadable. "Do you recognize this moment?" the woman asked. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "Can you describe what happened?" Eleanor hesitated. "Not long. Just enough. There was a misunderstanding about seating. The man in the center nodded. And how was it resolved? Eleanor's throat tightened. I sat down. The woman made a note. And Mr. Carter, he remained seated? Silence followed, heavy and deliberate. Eleanor felt the weight of it settle, the realization that words could not smooth everything away. Back in the boardroom, the discussion shifted. A proposal was introduced, framed as precaution, temporary delegation, shared authority. David listened without interruption, then spoke. You're asking me to step back, he said. The chairwoman met his eyes. We're asking you to consider the company's long-term stability. David nodded slowly. I am the company's long-term stability. A murmur rippled around the table. The man who had spoken earlier stiffened. No one is irreplaceable. David's gaze didn't waver. That's true, he said, but not all replacements are equal. The chairwoman raised a hand, forestalling further escalation. We're not voting today, she said. We're listening. David leaned back, exhaling quietly. He could feel the room recalibrating, the balance shifting. This was not a battle to be won in one meeting. It never was. Eleanor left the building an hour later, the sun already low, casting long shadows across the pavement. She walked slowly, heels clicking, each step deliberate. The associate who escorted her said nothing, and she was grateful for the silence. In the car, she stared out the window, replaying the photograph in her mind. The angle, the moment, the way it looked without context. She had always understood the power of images. She had never considered how easily they could turn. David returned to his office as dusk settled. He loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of water, and stood by the window. Below, the city pulsed, unaware of the quiet recalibrations happening above it. His phone buzzed. A message from the chairwoman. We'll continue this tomorrow. He typed a brief response and set the phone aside. Later that evening, Eleanor sat alone at the dining table, the house dark around her. Richard had not come home. She did not know where he was, and for once, she did not ask. She poured herself a glass of wine, then left it untouched. Her gaze drifted to the photograph she had turned partially aside days ago. She stood, crossed the room, and picked it up. She studied her own face in the image, the certainty, the assumption. She set the frame back down, this time facing fully away from her. David prepared for bed with the same care he brought to everything else. He folded his clothes, he set his alarm. He paused at the window one last time, watching the city settle. 2 rooms, 2 lives, both suspended in a moment of reckoning. One built on control, slipping through practiced fingers. The other on endurance, quiet and unyielding, holding its shape as pressure mounted. Outside, night deepened, wrapping the city in shadow. Decisions would come. Consequences would follow. For now, there was only waiting, and the knowledge that when morning arrived, nothing would be quite the same. The city woke to a low, unsettled energy, the kind that lived beneath headlines and polite conversations, where decisions were already being made before anyone admitted it. David felt it as soon as he stepped outside. The air sharper, sounds closer, the weight of expectation pressing in without a clear source. He adjusted his coat and started walking, letting the rhythm of his steps steady his thoughts. By mid-morning, the calls began. Not demands, invitations, requests framed as concern. Old contacts resurfaced, voices warm with familiarity. Each conversation circling the same unspoken question. Was he going to fight, or was he going to compromise? David answered carefully, saying little, listening more than he spoke. Silence, he had learned, revealed more than reassurance ever could. Across town, Eleanor Whitman sat in the back seat of her car, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing. The driver navigated traffic smoothly, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her phone rested beside her, face down. She had stopped checking it every few minutes. Whatever came next would arrive, whether she was ready or not. The building they approached was not one she frequented. Low, understated, its entrance marked by nothing more than a brass plaque and a security camera angled just so. Eleanor felt an unfamiliar prickle of unease as she stepped inside. No greeting, no smiles. Just a quiet nod and a gesture toward the elevator. The meeting room was spare. No art, no windows. 3 chairs. Eleanor took one, crossing her ankles neatly, posture immaculate. She waited, counting her breaths. David entered a different room on the other side of the city, this one lined with shelves of thick binders and framed certificates. He recognized the setup immediately. Institutional, deliberate. The kind of space designed to remind you that processes outlast people. A man in a dark suit gestured for him to sit. "We appreciate you coming in," he said. David nodded. "I was asked." "Yes," the man replied. "And you came." The distinction mattered. They spoke for nearly an hour. Not about the plane, not directly. They talked about governance, about responsibility, about what happened when influence went unchecked for too long. David answered honestly, never defensive, never accusatory. When asked what he wanted, he paused. "I want the rules applied evenly," he said finally. "That's all." The man studied him. "You know that creates discomfort." David met his gaze. "Discomfort isn't the same as harm." Silence followed. Then a nod. In Eleanor's room, the door opened and a woman entered, carrying a thin folder. She sat across from Eleanor, expression neutral. "We're going to ask you to walk us through the events of that day again," she said. Eleanor inhaled slowly. She began at the beginning. The flight, the delay, the seat. She chose her words carefully, framing actions as assumptions, intentions as misunderstandings. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She relied on the composure that had served her well for decades. The woman listened without interruption. When Eleanor finished, she closed the folder. "Do you believe," the woman asked evenly, "that your position influenced the outcome of that interaction?" Eleanor hesitated, just for a moment. Then she answered, "Yes." The word hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Eleanor felt a strange release as she said it, a tension easing even as consequences loomed. Across the city, David stood by a window, watching clouds gather. His phone buzzed, a message from his legal counsel. "They're moving." He typed back a single word. "Understood." By afternoon, the story shifted. Still careful, still restrained, but sharper now. Analysts spoke openly about patterns, about cultures of entitlement. Names were not shouted, but they were no longer hidden either. Eleanor saw it on a screen in a waiting room, her reflection faintly superimposed over the scrolling text. Her phone rang. Richard's number. She answered immediately. "Where are you?" "Not home," he replied. His voice sounded distant, strained. "They want me to make a statement." Eleanor closed her eyes. And they want me to step aside," he said. "For now." The words landed heavily. Eleanor said nothing. "I don't know if I can stop it," Richard added quietly. She swallowed. "Then don't." He paused. "What?" "If you fight it," Eleanor said slowly, "you make it worse." Silence stretched. Then a soft exhale. "You're right," he said. "I know you are." The call ended. Eleanor stared at the blank screen, feeling something shift inside her. Not relief, not resignation. Acceptance, perhaps. The understanding that some battles, once exposed, could not be won the old way. David left his meeting as evening approached, the sky darkening with the promise of rain. He walked instead of taking the car, needing the movement, the anonymity of the street. People passed him without recognition, carrying groceries, arguing on phones, laughing loudly. The world remained stubbornly ordinary. At a crosswalk, an older man stood beside him, waiting for the light. He glanced at David, then smiled faintly. "You look like someone carrying a lot," he said. David smiled back, surprised. "Some days," he replied. The light changed. They crossed together, then parted without another word. Eleanor returned home to a house that felt quieter than ever. She walked through the rooms slowly, touching surfaces, pausing in doorways. In the study, she found Richard's chair empty, his desk cleared of papers. A decision already enacted. She sat, the weight of it settling fully now. The life she had known was not gone, but it was irrevocably altered. She thought again of the plane, of the moment she had assumed compliance. How small that moment had been. How far it had traveled. David reached his apartment as rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadier. He stood on the balcony, letting drops land on his hands, grounding him in the present. His phone buzzed one last time. Board vote scheduled for tomorrow morning. He closed his eyes briefly, then nodded to himself. Tomorrow, then. In separate corners of the same city, both prepared for what morning would bring. One braced for judgment long delayed, the other for a decision that would test whether quiet endurance could outlast noise and pressure. The rain fell harder, washing the streets clean, carrying away the last illusions that anything could return to what it had been before. The boardroom filled slowly, chairs sliding back, leather creaking, the low murmur of people who understood that whatever happened next would echo far beyond this room. David took his seat near the center of the table, setting his notebook down but not opening it. He didn't need notes. He needed clarity. Across from him, the chairwoman watched the room settle, her expression composed, eyes sharp. Outside, morning light spilled across the city, clean and unforgiving. Inside, the air felt heavier, saturated with expectation. "We're here to conclude," the chairwoman said once the door closed. Her voice carried without effort. "We've heard arguments, we've reviewed findings. It's time to decide how we move forward." A man to David's right cleared his throat. "Before we vote, I want it on record that this situation did not begin with corporate misconduct. It began with a public incident that exposed deeper issues." Several heads turned toward David. He met their gaze without flinching. "That incident," the man continued, "forced scrutiny that was long overdue." David nodded once. "I agree." The admission rippled quietly through the room. The chairwoman leaned forward. "David, you've been asked more than once whether you're willing to step aside temporarily to ease pressure." David folded his hands. "And I've answered consistently," he said. "I won't abandon responsibility to preserve comfort." Silence followed. Not hostile. Contemplative. A woman near the window spoke next. "If we remove you, we confirm the narrative that integrity is negotiable." Another voice countered. "If we keep him, we signal defiance." David spoke again, calmly. "It isn't defiance to stand still. Sometimes it's the only honest position." The chairwoman closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "We're voting," she said. One by one, hands were raised. Not dramatically, not unanimously, but clearly. When the final count was tallied, the chairwoman nodded. The board affirms David Carter as chief executive, she announced, effective immediately and without conditions. David exhaled slowly. Not relief. Resolve. The room shifted, tension releasing in small, human ways. Chairs moved. Someone rubbed their temples. Another person smiled faintly, as if surprised by their own reaction. Meeting adjourned, the chairwoman said. David stood, offering a nod to the room. No speech, no victory lap. He gathered his things and walked out, the decision settling behind him like a closed door. Across town, Eleanor Whitman watched the same news break on a muted television. The banner scrolled steadily, the language precise, restrained. Board reaffirms leadership. Investigation ongoing. Whitman Group announces restructuring. She turned the sound on just as the anchor mentioned Richard's name. Interim leave. Cooperation. Rebuilding trust. Eleanor sat very still. Richard entered the room quietly, jacket over his arm, looking smaller than she remembered. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The truth had already arrived. They voted, he said finally. I know, Eleanor replied. He set his jacket down. I'm stepping back. She nodded. I know. He studied her face, searching for blame, for accusation. He found neither. This changes things. Yes, she said. It does. They sat in silence. Two people bound by history and habit, now forced to reckon with a future stripped of guarantees. Eleanor thought of the seat on the plane, of how instinctively she had reached for it, how natural it had felt to assume. She understood now that assumption was a language the world no longer spoke fluently. David left the building alone, declining offers of rides. He walked instead, letting the city absorb the moment with him. People passed, unaware of what had just been decided, carrying groceries, laughing into phones, living inside their own stories. At a crosswalk, he stopped, waiting for the light. A woman beside him glanced over, then smiled politely. He smiled back. The light changed. They crossed. Later, David stood in his apartment, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, the familiar quiet settling around him. His phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations, relief, caution. He didn't answer immediately. He poured a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the city breathe. He thought of his father again, of lessons learned without lectures, of dignity carried quietly even when no one was looking. Across the city, Eleanor walked through her home, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of frames, grounding herself in what remained. In the study, she stopped before the photograph of the private jet, still turned away. She picked it up, hesitated, then placed it back on the shelf facing outward. Not as a symbol, as a reminder. That evening, David received a final call from the chairwoman. This won't be easy, she said. I know, he replied, but it was necessary. Yes, David said. It was. When the call ended, he sat down, finally opening his notebook. He wrote a single line, then closed it again. Some plans didn't need to be detailed yet. They just needed to exist. Night settled over the city, lights flickering on like constellations mapped by human hands. Somewhere, lives were adjusting, recalibrating, learning the cost of certainty and the value of restraint. David turned off the lights and stood in the quiet, the weight of the day finally reaching him. He felt tired, grounded, ready. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like it, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment to share what stood out to you most.